My name is Shari, and at 32 years old, I found myself standing in a courthouse facing the two people I hadn't seen in 27 years, my biological parents who were now suing me for $5.5 million from the inheritance my adoptive father left me. As I looked at their faces, I was transported back to that day at Chicago O'Hare Airport when I was just 5 years old, sitting alone by the gate while they supposedly went to get coffee, never to return, leaving me with nothing but a note pinned to my jacket that changed my life forever. Before we dive into this incredible journey of abandonment, love, and the ultimate betrayal, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you've ever experienced family drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that will touch your heart. Trust me, what happened next in that courtroom will leave you speechless, so let's begin this emotional roller coaster together. The morning of my abandonment started like any other day, except my parents were acting strange in ways my 5-year-old mind couldn't quite understand. My mother kept wiping tears from her eyes while packing my small backpack with my favorite teddy bear and some snacks, and my father wouldn't look at me directly, his jaw clenched tight as he loaded our old sedan with just one suitcase. They told me we were going on an adventure, that we were flying somewhere special, but their voices shook with something I now recognize as guilt and desperation. At the airport, they walked me to gate B12, my tiny hand clutched in my mother's sweaty palm, and I remember how she kept stopping to hug me, whispering that she loved me over and over until the words lost their meaning. They sat me down in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs near the window where I could watch the planes take off and land, and my father knelt down to my level, finally meeting my eyes as he said they needed to get some coffee and would be right back. My mother pinned something to my jacket, her hands trembling so badly she pricked her finger and left a tiny spot of blood on the white paper. I watched them walk away, turning back twice to look at me, and then they disappeared into the crowd of travelers. I sat there like a good girl, swinging my legs that couldn't quite reach the floor, counting the planes and making up stories about where they were going, completely unaware that my life was about to change forever. 1 hour passed, then 2, and my stomach started to growl because I'd been too excited about our adventure to eat breakfast. I nibbled on the crackers my mother had packed, saving half because I wanted to share them with my parents when they came back. 3 hours in, I needed to use the bathroom but was too scared to leave my spot because what if they came back and couldn't find me? By hour 4, other travelers started noticing me, a few kind ladies asking if I was okay, but I just nodded and said my parents were coming back soon. It wasn't until hour 6, when the sun was starting to set and the airport was transitioning into evening flights, that a security officer approached me, his kind eyes filled with concern. Officer Martinez, as he introduced himself, sat down next to me and asked where my parents were, and I told him about the coffee that must be really far away. He gently unpinned the note from my jacket, and I watched his face change as he read it, his expression shifting from concern to something deeper, sadder. He radioed for backup and a social worker, speaking in codes I didn't understand, while I kept insisting my parents would be back any minute. The note, as I would learn years later when I was old enough to understand, simply said, "Please take care of our daughter. We cannot provide for her anymore. Her name is Shari Williams, born March 15th. She has no allergies and loves to read. Please tell her we're sorry." The next few days blurred together in a haze of strange faces, temporary facilities, and questions I couldn't answer. Why did your parents leave? Where are your other relatives? Did they hurt you? I was placed in an emergency foster home with a nice couple who already had 3 kids, and while they were kind, I felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit into their already complete picture. I cried myself to sleep every night, clutching my teddy bear and whispering into his worn fur that my parents would come back tomorrow. They just got lost, they just forgot where they left me. It was 2 weeks later when James Mitchell walked into the children's center where I spent my days while my foster parents worked. He was there as part of a corporate volunteer program, this tall man in an expensive suit who looked completely out of place sitting on the tiny chairs in the playroom. But something about him drew me in, maybe it was the sadness in his eyes that matched mine, or the way he didn't talk to me in that fake cheerful voice adults used with foster kids. When he asked what I was drawing, I showed him my picture of an airplane with 3 stick figures standing next to it, and he understood without me having to explain that I was still waiting for my parents to come back from their coffee run. James started visiting regularly, always bringing books because I'd mentioned I loved to read, just like the note said. He'd sit with me for hours, reading stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms where families always found their way back to each other. One day, about a month after we met, he asked if I'd like to live with him permanently, and I remember feeling this strange mix of hope and guilt because saying yes felt like giving up on my parents returning. But James promised that if they ever came back, he'd make sure I knew about it, and something in his voice made me believe him. The adoption process wasn't easy for a single businessman in his 40s trying to adopt a 5-year-old girl. Social workers questioned his motives, judges scrutinized his finances and lifestyle, and more than once it seemed like the system would rather keep me bouncing between foster homes than place me with someone who genuinely wanted me. But James had something many others didn't have: unlimited resources and an iron will. He hired the best family lawyers in Chicago, underwent every assessment and home study with patience, and even took parenting classes to prove his commitment. 6 months after we met, the adoption was finalized, and I officially became Shari Mitchell. Moving into James's Lakeshore Drive penthouse was like stepping into a fairy tale, but he was careful not to overwhelm me with too much too soon. He'd converted one of his guest rooms into a little girl's paradise, painted soft purple because I'd mentioned it was my favorite color, with shelves full of books and a window seat overlooking Lake Michigan. But more than the material things, what James gave me was stability and unconditional love. He never missed a bedtime story, learned to braid hair from YouTube videos, and sat through countless tea parties with my stuffed animals. When I'd wake up screaming from nightmares about being left alone, he'd hold me until I calmed down, promising over and over that he would never leave me. Years later, when I was 16 and could handle the truth, James told me what his private investigator had discovered about my biological parents. They'd been deep in debt to some dangerous people, gambling addicts who'd burned through every resource and relationship they had. The investigator found evidence that they'd been approached by human traffickers willing to buy me to clear their debts, and abandoning me at the airport had been their twisted version of saving me. They'd had 3 more children after me, and records showed all of them had been removed by Child Protective Services for neglect and abuse. It was a pattern of bringing lives into the world only to use them as pawns in their destructive games. Understanding this history helped explain but never excuse what they'd done. James made sure I had the best therapists to work through my abandonment issues, never pushing but always supporting my healing journey. He taught me that family wasn't about blood but about who showed up every day, who celebrated your victories and held you through your defeats. He showed me this truth by being at every school play, every soccer game where I mostly warmed the bench, every science fair where my volcano barely fizzled. He taught me the value of hard work by having me intern at his company during summers, starting in the mailroom despite owning the building. He wanted me to understand that wealth was a tool, not an identity, and that every person deserved respect regardless of their bank account balance. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, giving a speech about chosen families that had him crying in the front row, I had grown from that abandoned little girl into a confident young woman. The scar of abandonment would always be there, but James had helped me build a life so full of love and purpose that the old wound rarely ached. I was heading to Harvard Business School, not because he pushed me but because I'd inherited his love of business and wanted to make him proud. The morning I left for college, he hugged me at the airport, the irony not lost on either of us, and whispered that I was the best decision he'd ever made. I believed him because James Mitchell had never lied to me, not once in 13 years. My teenage years with James were a masterclass in what unconditional parental love looked like, even when I pushed boundaries like all teenagers do. When I was 15 and came home with a belly button piercing I'd gotten without permission, he didn't yell or ground me but sat me down for a discussion about body autonomy and decision-making that somehow left me feeling more guilty than any punishment would have. He had this way of guiding without controlling, of letting me make mistakes while ensuring the safety net of his love was always there to catch me. During my rebellious phase, when I dyed my hair black and listened to angry music about broken families, he simply asked if I wanted to start a band and offered to pay for guitar lessons. The college application process became our joint project, with James taking time off work to drive me to campus visits across the country. He never pushed his alma mater or tried to use his connections for unfair advantages, insisting that wherever I got in would be on my own merits. When the Harvard acceptance letter arrived, He framed it and hung it in his office next to his own diploma, telling anyone who would listen that his daughter was going to change the world. The night before I left for Cambridge, we sat on our terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline, sharing deep dish pizza and stories, and he gave me a leather journal with an inscription that read, "For all the adventures your old man will miss but can't wait to hear about." Harvard challenged me in ways I hadn't expected, surrounded by legacy students who wore their privilege like designer labels while I carried the weight of representing not just James but every abandoned child who never got their second chance. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in business with a minor in social entrepreneurship, determined to use my education to help kids like me. James called every Sunday without fail, learning to FaceTime despite his technological challenges, and sent care packages filled with my favorite Chicago treats that made me briefly homesick for our penthouse and his terrible dad jokes. During my junior year, I made the difficult decision to pursue summer internships at firms that competed with James's company, wanting to prove I could succeed without the Mitchell name opening doors. He not only supported this choice but coached me through the applications, helping me prepare for interviews while never once suggesting I take the easier path of working for him. When I landed a prestigious internship at McKinsey in New York, he flew out to help me apartment hunt, insisting on checking every lock and testing every smoke detector like the overprotective father he'd become. The call about James's first heart attack came during my senior year, right in the middle of thesis presentations. I abandoned everything, racing to Chicago on the first flight I could catch, my mind spinning with prayers to any deity that might be listening. Finding him in the cardiac unit, looking suddenly fragile with all those monitors and wires, shattered the image I'd held of him as invincible. He tried to joke that his heart was just making room for all the pride he felt about my upcoming graduation, but I could see the fear in his eyes, not of dying but of leaving me. The doctors said it was a mild attack, that with medication and lifestyle changes he'd be fine, but something shifted that day as I realized our time together wasn't infinite. During his recovery, James finally told me about the private investigator he'd hired to monitor my biological parents over the years, showing me files he'd kept locked away. The reports painted a picture of two people who'd continued their destructive patterns, having 3 more children over 8 years, each one eventually removed by child services for neglect, abandonment, or exposure to dangerous situations. My biological mother had been arrested multiple times for fraud and theft, while my father drifted between get-rich-quick schemes and loan sharks. They'd never once attempted to find me or check on my well-being, never filed a missing person report, never showed any remorse for walking away from their 5-year-old daughter in an airport. The investigators' most recent report showed them living in a rundown apartment in Detroit, still together in their toxic codependency, still blaming everyone but themselves for their circumstances. James had kept all this from me to protect my healing, but now he wanted me to know the truth in case they ever tried to re-enter my life. He'd also discovered I had 3 half-siblings scattered across different foster homes and group facilities, all bearing the scars of our parents' negligence. The youngest, a girl named Trinity, was only 12 and had already been in 5 different placements. The files included their names and locations, giving me the choice to reach out if I ever wanted to connect with the only other people who might understand my origin story. After graduation, where James embarrassed me by hiring a plane to fly a congratulations banner over Harvard Yard, I surprised him by accepting a position at Goldman Sachs in New York instead of returning to Chicago. He supported this decision too, understanding my need to build my own reputation before potentially joining his company. I threw myself into the 100-hour weeks of investment banking, using the analytical skills he'd taught me at our kitchen table with Monopoly Money and annual reports. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted twice, earning a reputation as someone who could see value where others saw risk, perhaps because I'd learned early that the best investments aren't always the obvious ones. Success in New York felt hollow without James to share it with directly, so I instituted our weekly dinner tradition via video call, setting up my laptop at my dining table while he did the same in Chicago. We'd eat together virtually, discussing everything from market trends to my dating disasters, maintaining our connection despite the physical distance. He never pressured me to come home but made sure I knew there would always be a place for me in his company and his life whenever I was ready. These calls became my anchor, reminding me that no matter how well I did professionally, my greatest achievement was being chosen by James Mitchell. It was during one of these virtual dinners that I told James about my plan to start a foundation for abandoned and fostered children, using my Wall Street bonuses to provide college scholarships and mentorship programs. His eyes lit up with pride as I outlined my vision, and he immediately offered to match every dollar I raised, turning what could have been a small personal project into something with real impact potential. We spent hours refining the business plan, him teaching me about nonprofit governance and sustainable funding models, both of us carefully avoiding the obvious connection to my own story while knowing it was the driving force behind everything. The Mitchell Foundation for Forgotten Children launched on the 15th anniversary of my adoption, with a gala in New York that James insisted on attending despite his cardiologist's concerns about travel. Watching him work the room, charming donors with stories about his brilliant daughter while carefully avoiding any mention of my origins, I realized he'd spent 15 years protecting me from pity while ensuring I never forgot where I came from. That night, we raised enough to put 20 kids through their first year of college, and James made a surprise announcement that he was restructuring his will to ensure the foundation would receive significant funding in perpetuity. 6 months later, I made the decision to leave Goldman Sachs and return to Chicago, accepting a senior position at a private equity firm that specialized in social impact investing. James tried to hide his joy at having me home, but I caught him converting one of his home office spaces into a workspace for me, just in case you need to work from home sometimes. We resumed our in-person weekly dinners, now at his favorite steakhouse where the staff knew our order by heart, and I noticed how he'd aged during my time away, his hair fully gray now and his movements a bit slower, though his mind remained sharp as ever. One evening, as we walked along the lakefront after dinner, James told me about meeting with his estate attorneys to finalize his will. He wanted me to know that I would inherit everything including his company's shares, real estate holdings, and personal assets worth approximately $5.5 million. I tried to protest that I didn't need his money, that his love had been more than enough, but he squeezed my hand and said that everything he'd built meant nothing if he couldn't ensure I'd be secure forever. He also mentioned adding specific language to prevent any challenges to the will, his eyes taking on a protective gleam that told me he'd considered scenarios I hadn't yet imagined. The second heart attack hit James on a Tuesday morning in his office, and this time the damage was severe enough that his assistant found him collapsed behind his desk, clutching his chest with papers scattered everywhere. I got the call while in a board meeting, and the world tilted off its axis as I ran from the building, leaving everything behind except my phone and keys. The ride to Northwestern Memorial Hospital felt endless, every red light a personal insult, every slow driver an obstacle between me and the man who'd saved my life. I found him in the cardiac ICU, unconscious and connected to more machines than I could count, his skin a gray color that made my stomach clench with fear I couldn't name. The cardiologist explained that James needed emergency triple bypass surgery, that his arteries were severely blocked despite the medications and lifestyle changes he'd claimed to follow after the first attack. As they wheeled him into surgery, he briefly opened his eyes and squeezed my hand, whispering that he needed me to be strong no matter what happened. Those 6 hours of waiting felt like years, pacing the surgical waiting room while fielding calls from his business part. 2 weeks after we buried James, I was sitting in his study trying to make sense of financial documents when the doorbell rang with an insistence that made my skin crawl. Through the security monitor, I saw a process server in an ill-fitting suit shifting nervously from foot to foot. My hands shook as I signed for the envelope, already knowing what darkness it would contain. The lawsuit was filed in Cook County Circuit Court, case number that would become burned into my memory, with my biological parents listed as plaintiffs seeking their rightful share of James Mitchell's estate as the natural and legal parents of his beneficiary. The legal documents were a masterpiece of twisted logic and revisionist history, painting my abandonment as a temporary arrangement made under economic duress and claiming they had never legally terminated their parental rights. Their lawyer, a bottom feeder named Randy Kowalski who advertised on bus benches, argued that since they were my biological parents and had never formally agreed to the adoption, they were entitled to a portion of any inheritance I received. The amount they sought was everything, the entire $5.5 million, claiming I had been unjustly enriched by their temporary inability to provide care. Reading their version of events, where they were victims and James was some predator who'd stolen their child, made me physically ill. I immediately called Harrison Pemberton, the senior partner at James's law firm who'd handled his personal affairs for 30 years. Harrison had been at my adoption hearing, my high school graduation, and every major moment of my life with James. He read through the lawsuit while I paced his office, his face growing darker with each page. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his temples before speaking carefully about Illinois inheritance law and the potential challenges we faced. While the case seemed ridiculous on its face, he warned that family court could be unpredictable and judges sometimes made decisions based on emotion rather than law. We assembled a legal team that would have made James proud, 3 partners and 2 associates who specialized in estate litigation and family law. The strategy sessions felt like war councils, mapping out every possible argument my parents might make and preparing counterarguments backed by decades of evidence. Harrison suggested we hire our own investigator to dig deeper into my biological parents' past, and within days we had a 40-page dossier that revealed the full extent of their pattern of exploitation. Beyond abandoning me and their other children, they had a history of elder abuse, trying to get power of attorney over vulnerable relatives, and multiple fraud convictions. The media caught wind of the story when my biological father, emboldened by liquid courage, called a press conference on the courthouse steps. He wept crocodile tears about his stolen daughter and the rich man who bought her, conveniently forgetting to mention the abandonment note or the fact that he'd never paid a cent of child support. My biological mother stood beside him in a dress that looked borrowed, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue while nodding along to his fabrications. By evening, the story was trending on social media with the hashtag airport abandonment, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with interview requests I had no intention of accepting. The public response split predictably, with some bleeding hearts believing my parents' sob story while others, particularly those who'd experienced abandonment themselves, saw through the manipulation. My inbox flooded with messages from adoptees sharing their own stories and offering support. Several of James's business associates reached out, offering to testify about his character and our relationship. The Mitchell Foundation children sent handmade cards telling me to be strong like Mr. James taught us, which broke my heart in the best way. But there were also cruel messages from strangers who believed my parents deserved a second chance, who thought money could somehow erase 27 years of absence. As we prepared for the first hearing, more details about my biological parents emerged that made their lawsuit even more appalling. They had contacted my half-siblings, the 3 children they'd also abandoned, trying to get them to support the lawsuit in exchange for a cut of the money. 2 of them immediately refused and reached out to me through Harrison, sharing their own abandonment stories and offering to testify on my behalf. Trinity, the youngest, sent a heartbreaking letter about how she'd seen our parents twice in her life, both times when they needed something from her. The 3rd sibling, Marcus, initially stayed silent, and we later learned they were pressuring him with promises of finally being a real family if he helped them get the money. The first hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, and I dressed in the navy suit James had bought me for my Harvard graduation, wearing his cufflinks for strength. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curiosity seekers, forcing Harrison's team to form a protective circle around me as we pushed through. My biological parents were already there, flanked by their bargain bin lawyer and a PR representative they'd somehow afforded, probably on a contingency basis. My father tried to approach me, arms outstretched as if expecting a reunion embrace, but Harrison stepped between us while security intervened. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patricia Kovac presided with a no-nonsense demeanor that gave me hope. She'd reviewed the initial filings and seemed skeptical of my parents' claims, but she allowed the case to proceed to discovery, wanting to see all evidence before making any decisions. Kowalski painted a picture of young parents overwhelmed by poverty who made a desperate decision they'd regretted ever since, claiming they'd searched for me but been thwarted by James's wealth and influence. When he suggested James had essentially purchased a child to fill his empty life, Harrison objected so forcefully the judge had to call for order. Our side presented the basic facts including the abandonment note in my mother's handwriting, the police report from O'Hare Airport, and the adoption records showing all proper procedures were followed. We also submitted evidence that my parents had never filed a missing person report, never contacted authorities about their temporarily left child, and had gone on to have and abandon 3 more children. The judge's expression grew stonier with each revelation, but she maintained judicial neutrality and scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for the following month, ordering both sides to complete discovery. The restraining order became necessary when my biological parents escalated their harassment, showing up at my workplace despite security warnings. My father cornered me in the parking garage after I'd worked late, approaching my car before I could lock the doors. He leaned in through my window, his breath sour with cheap whiskey, and told me I was being selfish, that family should take care of family. When I tried to close the window, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises, saying I owed them for giving me life. I managed to activate my car alarm, causing security to come running, but not before he hissed that they'd destroy me if I didn't share Daddy's money. That night, I filed for an emergency order of protection, including the security footage and photos of my bruised wrist. The judge granted it immediately, ordering my parents to stay 500 feet away from me, my home, and workplace. But pieces of paper don't stop desperate people, and they simply shifted to a campaign of character assassination. They gave interviews to any outlet that would have them, each version of their story more elaborate than the last. In one, they claimed I'd been sending them money for years until James died. In another, they said James had promised to reunite our family but I'd poisoned him against them. The lies came so fast and contradictory that fact-checkers couldn't keep up. Meanwhile, our legal team built an overwhelming case. We found the social workers who'd handled my abandonment, now retired but willing to testify about finding a 5-year-old girl alone at an international airport. We tracked down Officer Martinez, the security guard who'd first responded, who still remembered me and was horrified to learn my parents were trying to profit from their crime. The forensic accountant we hired traced my parents' financial history, showing a pattern of bankruptcy, fraud, and using their children as pawns for sympathy or scams. Every stone we turned over revealed more evidence of their moral bankruptcy. The discovery phase of the lawsuit felt like performing surgery on my past without anesthesia. Every document request reopening wounds I thought had healed. My parents' lawyer demanded access to every financial record from James's estate, claiming they needed to verify the assets to ensure I wasn't hiding money that rightfully belonged to them. They wanted bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, and even personal correspondence between James and me, fishing for any evidence they could twist to support their delusional claim. Harrison fought every overreaching request, but Judge Kovac allowed broad discovery, warning that any attempts to hide assets would be dealt with harshly. The depositions were scheduled for a conference room at Harrison's law firm, neutral ground that still felt like enemy territory when my biological parents walked in. Seeing them up close for the first time since the funeral, I was struck by how ordinary evil could look, just two broken people in cheap clothes trying to steal what they'd never earned. My mother had dyed her hair an unnatural black that made her skin look sallow, while my father's face bore the bloated marks of sustained alcohol abuse. They sat across from me at the polished table, trying to project parental authority over a daughter they'd thrown away like garbage. My deposition lasted 8 hours, with Kowalski trying every trick to paint me as an ungrateful child who'd abandoned her real family for wealth. He asked about my memories of them, forcing me to relive that day at the airport in excruciating detail. When I described waiting for hours, watching planes, and counting ceiling tiles, my mother actually had the audacity to cry, whimpering about how hard it had been for her too. The court reporter captured every word as I explained finding their note years later, learning about my half-siblings, discovering their criminal records and pattern of child abandonment. Kowalski tried to object to the characterization, but Harrison smoothly introduced court documents proving every allegation. When it came time for my parents' depositions, their stories began to crumble under professional questioning. My father claimed they'd left me momentarily while dealing with a family emergency, but couldn't explain why that emergency lasted 27 years. He insisted they'd searched for me desperately, but couldn't provide a single piece of evidence including missing person reports, private investigator receipts, or even Facebook posts. When Harrison asked why they'd had 3 more children while supposedly searching for me, my father's temper flared, revealing the violent man beneath the victim mask as he slammed his fist on the table and called the questions irrelevant. My mother's deposition was a masterclass in manipulation and crocodile tears. She wept through most of it, requiring frequent breaks that Kowalski used to coach her on answers. She painted herself as a young mother overwhelmed by poverty, forced to make an impossible choice, but Harrison systematically destroyed her narrative. He introduced evidence of her gambling addiction, showing casino records from the week after my abandonment where she'd blown through $5,000. He presented arrest records for theft, fraud, and child endangerment relating to my half-siblings. When he asked why she'd pinned a note to me instead of seeking help from family services, she broke character momentarily, snapping that I should be grateful I ended up rich instead of dead. The real breakthrough came when we subpoenaed records from Chicago O'Hare Airport security archives. Through some miracle of bureaucratic pack-ratting, they'd digitized old surveillance footage from the 90s, including the day of my abandonment. The grainy black and white video showed my parents walking me to the gate, my mother pinning the note to my jacket, and then both of them walking away without looking back. The timestamp showed they left at 9:43 a.m. and never returned. Additional footage from airport exits showed them leaving the terminal 20 minutes later, getting into their car, and driving away. They hadn't gotten coffee. They hadn't encountered an emergency. They'd executed a premeditated plan to abandon their child. We also deposed my half-siblings, whose testimony devastated any remaining shred of my parents' credibility. Destiny, the eldest after me, described being left at a fire station when she was 3 with a similar note. She'd bounced through foster care for 15 years, aging out without ever being adopted, and now worked 3 jobs to pay for community college. She looked at our parents with such hatred that even their lawyer seemed uncomfortable. Marcus, who they'd tried to recruit for their scheme, revealed they'd offered him 20% of whatever they won if he testified that they'd always talked about finding me. He'd recorded the conversation on his phone, which Harrison entered into evidence. Trinity's deposition was conducted via video link from her group home, as she was still a minor. At 17, she had the hollow eyes of someone who'd learned not to expect anything from adults. She testified that our parents had visited her exactly twice in her life, both times asking her to sign documents or lie to social workers. The second time, when she was 14, they tried to convince her to claim abuse in her foster home so they could regain custody and collect the state payments. When she refused, our father had called her a worthless brat just like your sisters. The judge authorized Trinity's testimony to be sealed to protect her privacy, but the damage to my parents' case was irreparable. Character witnesses for James created a stark contrast to my biological parents' sordid history. His business partners testified about his integrity, describing deals where he'd taken losses rather than break his word. Employees shared stories of his quiet generosity, from paying for cancer treatments to funding their children's educations. My teachers from elementary through high school testified about his involvement in my life, never missing a parent-teacher conference or school play. The principal from my high school broke down describing how James had established a scholarship fund for foster children that had already helped dozens graduate. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who'd treated me for abandonment trauma. She'd kept meticulous notes from our sessions, documenting my night terrors, separation anxiety, and deep-seated fear that James would leave me too. She explained how abandonment at such a young age creates lasting psychological damage, how I'd struggled to form friendships because I expected everyone to leave, how James's consistent presence over years had slowly helped me heal. When asked about reunification with biological parents after such trauma, she stated professionally that it would be psychologically harmful and potentially dangerous given their history of manipulation and exploitation. Throughout the discovery process, my parents' behavior outside court became increasingly erratic. They started a GoFundMe claiming they were fighting to reunite with their daughter against a corrupt system, raising $12,000 before the platform shut it down for fraud. They sold their story to a tabloid for $25,000, filling it with lies about James kidnapping me and brainwashing me against them. The story included photoshopped pictures of them supposedly searching for me over the years, which our technical expert easily debunked. They even started a Facebook group called Parents' Rights Against Illegal Adoption, that quickly filled with other deadbeat parents looking to justify their own abandonments. The forensic accounting revealed the true motivation behind my parents' sudden interest in me. They owed over $300,000 in various debts including back taxes, credit cards maxed out at casinos, and loans from questionable sources. Their current income consisted of disability payments my father collected for a suspicious back injury and my mother's sporadic earnings from phone scams targeting the elderly. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment with utilities regularly shut off for non-payment, their car had been repossessed twice, and they'd been evicted from 4 apartments in the past 2 years. The $5.5 million they sought would clear their debts and fund their habits for the rest of their lives. As we prepared for trial, Harrison's team uncovered one final piece of evidence that showed the premeditated nature of my parents' scheme. Email records subpoenaed from their lawyer revealed correspondence dating back 6 months before James's death, inquiring about inheritance rights of biological parents in Illinois. They'd been planning this while James was still alive, tracking his health through public records and news about his company. One email from my father to Kowalski asked, "How soon after the old man dies can we file?" The callousness of it made even our seasoned legal team pause in disgust. The morning of the trial arrived with the kind of crisp Chicago autumn day that James had loved, the sky crystal clear and Lake Michigan sparkling in the distance as I rode to the courthouse. I wore the black dress I'd bought for his funeral, adding the pearl necklace he'd given me for my 21st birthday, carrying his memory with me like armor. The courthouse steps were packed with media, protesters from adoptive parent groups supporting me, and a smaller contingent of biological parent advocates who'd bought into my parents' propaganda. Harrison's team formed their protective formation again, but this time I walked with my head high, no longer the abandoned 5-year-old but a woman defending the man who'd chosen to love me. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The gallery was packed with James's friends, my colleagues, social workers who'd followed the case, and journalists scribbling notes. Judge Kovac entered with a stern expression that suggested she'd reviewed all our submissions and wasn't pleased with what she'd seen. My biological parents sat at the plaintiff's table trying to look respectable in clothes that were obviously borrowed, my mother clutching a tissue she'd never actually used while my father glared at me with undisguised greed. Kowalski shuffled papers nervously, perhaps realizing he'd attached himself to a sinking ship. Harrison's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled fury wrapped in legal precedent. He laid out the timeline of my abandonment, James's rescue and raising of me, and my parents' sudden appearance only after his death and their discovery of his wealth. He played the airport footage on a large screen, forcing everyone to watch them walk away from a 5-year-old me, the timestamp showing hours passing with no return. He displayed the abandonment note in my mother's handwriting, now preserved as evidence of child endangerment. He presented the pattern of their other abandonments, their criminal records, their debts, and the email evidence of their premeditation. By the time he finished, several jury members were visibly disgusted. Kowalski's opening was a desperate attempt to reframe abandonment as sacrifice, painting my parents as young people who made the hardest decision of their lives to give me a better chance. He claimed they'd left me in a safe place where they knew I'd be found and cared for, that they'd suffered every day since with the pain of their choice. He suggested James had used his wealth and influence to block their attempts to find me, that the adoption had been rushed through without proper attempts to locate biological family. He even implied that James had somehow orchestrated their financial troubles to keep them from reclaiming me. The jury looked skeptical, but he pressed on with the theatrical flair of a man who knew performance was all he had. My biological mother was called as the first witness, approaching the stand with practiced fragility. Under Kowalski's gentle questioning, she spun a tale of young love destroyed by poverty, of choosing to give me up rather than raise me in squalor, of searching for years but being blocked at every turn. She claimed the note was meant to ensure I was cared for temporarily while they got their lives together, that they'd always intended to return. She wept prettily as she described seeing me on the news after James adopted me, knowing I was safe but being too ashamed to disrupt my new life. It was a performance worthy of community theater, hitting every emotional note while avoiding any inconvenient facts. Harrison's cross-examination stripped away her mask with surgical precision. He asked why, if the abandonment was temporary, she'd written, "Please take care of our daughter," instead of, "We'll be back." He introduced her casino records showing she'd gambled away thousands in the days after abandoning me. He questioned why she'd had 3 more children while supposedly too poor to care for me, then abandoned them too. When she tried to claim those were different circumstances, he presented the fire station security footage of her leaving 3-year-old Destiny. Her tears turned real as her story collapsed, ending with her screaming that we didn't understand what it was like to have nothing while wearing earrings she'd shoplifted the week before. My father took the stand with barely controlled rage, his victim persona slipping with every question. He insisted they'd been forced to leave me by circumstances beyond their control, but couldn't explain what those circumstances were beyond being poor. When Harrison asked why poverty prevented them from keeping me but not from having 3 more children, he snarled that Harrison wouldn't understand real struggle. The questioning revealed his extensive criminal record, including assault, fraud, and attempting to sell his eldest son's identity for credit cards. When confronted with the email evidence of planning to sue before James died, he claimed it was about being prepared to claim what was rightfully theirs, seemingly unaware he'd just admitted to plotting against a dying man. The parade of witnesses for our side painted a clear picture of the vast difference between my biological parents and James. Officer Martinez, now retired, testified about finding me at the airport, describing how I'd been so well behaved even in abandonment, still believing my parents would return. The social worker who'd handled my case presented records showing no attempt by my parents to reclaim me or even check on my welfare. Former teachers testified about James's devotion, showing cards I'd made him for Father's Day that he'd shared proudly. The principal of my elementary school revealed that James had asked him to call if any strangers ever inquired about me, a precaution that now seemed prescient. My siblings' testimonies via video link devastated whatever remained of our parents' credibility. Each told their story of abandonment and neglect, of promises broken and childhood stolen. Marcus revealed more recordings of our parents coaching him on testimony, including our father saying, "Just remember, that money should have been ours all along." Trinity made the courtroom cry as she described spending every birthday alone, watching other kids get adopted while our parents never even sent a card. Destiny's anger was palpable as she told the jury about aging out of foster care, working minimum wage jobs while our parents lived states away and never once tried to help any of their abandoned children. When I took the stand, the courtroom fell silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the quiet whir of the court recorder. I spoke directly to the jury as I described that day at O'Hare, the weight of my backpack with my teddy bear inside, the hard plastic chair, the way the sun moved across the terminal floor as hours passed. I told them about the nightmares that lasted years, waking up screaming for parents who never came back, about James holding me until I believed I was safe. I shared the milestones they missed, including my first day of school, learning to ride a bike, getting my driver's license, graduating from Harvard, all with James cheering me on. I explained that family isn't about DNA but about who shows up, who stays, who loves you even when it's hard. The most difficult part was when Harrison played James's video message, recorded 3 days before his death. On the screen, my father looked frail but his voice was strong as he spoke directly to whatever judge might hear it. He explained finding me at the Children's Center, falling in love with a little girl who still drew pictures of airplanes and families. He detailed every legal step of my adoption, his efforts to ensure my biological parents couldn't hurt me again, his pride in the woman I'd become despite my traumatic start. He ended by saying that leaving me his estate wasn't about money but about ensuring the daughter of his heart would never be abandoned again. There wasn't a dry eye in the jury box, and even Judge Kovac wiped her eyes. Kowalski's closing argument was a last desperate appeal to sympathy, asking the jury to consider the poverty that drove my parents' decision, suggesting that biological bonds couldn't be severed by abandonment. He argued that Illinois law favored biological parents and that my inheritance rightfully belonged to them as my creators. He painted me as a selfish daughter denying her parents their rightful share of wealth accumulated during their absence. It was a weak ending to a case built on lies, and he seemed to know it, rushing through his points while avoiding eye contact with anyone. The jury looked unmoved, several members glancing at my parents with open contempt. Harrison's closing was a tribute to chosen family and the man who'd saved me. He walked the jury through the evidence once more, including the abandonment, the pattern of exploitation, the premeditated attempt to profit from James's death. He asked them to consider what message they'd send if biological parents could abandon children then return decades later to claim inheritance from the people who'd actually raised them. He reminded them that my parents hadn't sought reunion but money, hadn't offered love but lawsuits. He finished by reading the inscription James had written in my journal before I left for college, "For all the adventures your old man will miss but can't wait to hear about," and noted that my parents had missed every adventure by choice. The jury deliberated for exactly 2 hours and 7 minutes, though it felt like years as I paced the courthouse hallway. When they filed back in, I searched their faces for clues and found resolve. The foreman stood to read the verdict that they found in favor of the defendant on all counts, that my biological parents had no claim to James Mitchell's estate, that the abandonment constituted forfeiture of any parental rights or claims. Judge Kovac added her own thoughts, stating that the evidence showed a clear pattern of child abandonment for profit and that the plaintiff's attempt to monetize their biological connection was morally reprehensible and legally baseless. The courtroom erupted as the verdict was read. My father lunged across the barrier toward me, screaming about ungrateful children and stolen money, requiring 3 bailiffs to restrain him. My mother collapsed theatrically, wailing about injustice while Kowalski tried to calm them enough to avoid contempt charges. Judge Kovac ordered them removed and held my father for attempted assault, setting bail at $10,000 they couldn't pay. As they were dragged out, my mother's final words to me were that I was just like him, meaning James, which I took as the highest compliment she'd ever given me. The media storm after the verdict was intense but brief, as newer scandals quickly replaced our family drama in the public consciousness. I gave one exclusive interview to a reputable journalist who'd covered the story fairly, using the platform to discuss the realities of child abandonment and the importance of adoption. The interview went viral, not for the sensational aspects but for my message about chosen families and the damage biological parents can inflict when they view children as possessions rather than people. Letters poured in from adoptees and abandoned children sharing their stories, thanking me for showing that DNA doesn't determine worth. My biological parents' aftermath was swift and pathetic. My father spent 30 days in jail for the courtroom assault, while my mother tried to sell their story to increasingly downmarket tabloids. Their 15 minutes of fame ended when they were arrested for a check-kiting scheme targeting elderly victims, finally facing consequences for their lifetime of grift. The last I heard, they were serving 3 to 5 years in separate facilities, their relationship finally as broken as the lives they damaged. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, just a weary relief that they could no longer hurt anyone else's children. The real work began with my siblings, particularly Trinity, who was about to age out of foster care with nowhere to go. Using part of my inheritance, I petitioned to become her guardian for her final year in the system, then helped her apply to colleges with essays about resilience that made admissions officers cry. Destiny and I grew closer as I helped her finish community college and transfer to a 4-year university, her anger at our parents slowly transforming into determination to break the cycle. Marcus took longer to trust me, wounded by our parents' manipulation, but eventually accepted help starting his own business. We weren't a traditional family, but we were survivors bound by shared abandonment who chose to support each other. I expanded the Mitchell Foundation significantly, creating programs specifically for children who'd been abandoned or severely neglected. We funded therapy, educational support, and aged-out foster youth programs, trying to fill gaps in a system that too often forgot children once they turned 18. Every success story felt like a tribute to James, proof that one person choosing to love a throwaway child could ripple outward infinitely. I insisted on being hands-on, reviewing applications personally and meeting with recipients, seeing younger versions of myself in their wary hope. Dating had always been challenging given my abandonment issues, but after the trial, I found myself even more guarded. How could I trust anyone when my own creators had seen me as disposable? It took months of therapy to work through the re-triggered trauma, to separate my parents' sins from my own worth. Eventually, I met David at a foundation fundraiser, an attorney who specialized in children's advocacy and understood my baggage because he carried his own. He'd grown up in foster care, aging out without adoption, and built his career on protecting kids like us. Our first date lasted 8 hours, comparing survival stories and finding dark humor in shared trauma. David never pushed for more than I could give, understanding that trust came slowly for people like us. He met my siblings before he met my friends, recognizing that chosen family meant everything to abandonment survivors. When he proposed 2 years later at the airport gate where my story began, transforming a site of trauma into one of joy, I said yes through tears that finally felt healing rather than painful. James would have loved him, would have appreciated how he protected my heart while encouraging me to open it. We married in a small ceremony with my siblings, Harrison, and James's closest friends, the family I'd built from ashes. Pregnancy terrified me in ways I hadn't expected, bringing up every fear about repeating patterns and genetic predispositions. What if I had my parents' capacity for abandonment lurking in my DNA? David held me through hormone-fueled panic attacks, reminding me that James had proven nurture trumped nature. Still, I insisted on extra therapy to address these fears, working through generational trauma before passing it on. When our daughter arrived, perfect and screaming and absolutely wanted, I understood viscerally what my parents had thrown away. Looking at her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I couldn't fathom choosing anything over protecting her. We named her Jamie, after the man who'd shown me what parents should be. Holding her in the hospital room, I remembered James teaching me that love was a choice you made daily, not an obligation of biology. I promised her and myself that she would never question whether she was wanted, never sit alone wondering when someone would come back, never feel like a burden or mistake. David and I would make plenty of parenting mistakes, but abandonment would never be one of them. She would grow up so surrounded by chosen family that blood relations would seem like a quaint technicality. The foundation work led to policy advocacy, testifying before state legislators about the need for stronger penalties for child abandonment and better support for adoptive families. I shared my story repeatedly, the pain becoming purpose as laws slowly changed. Illinois passed Shari's law, increasing criminal penalties for abandonment and creating civil remedies for abandoned children seeking damages from biological parents who reappeared seeking profit. Other states followed suit, recognizing that abandonment caused lifelong damage deserving of legal remedy. It wasn't about punishment but protection, ensuring other abandoned children wouldn't face what I had. Visiting James's grave became a monthly ritual, updating him on the foundation's work and my siblings' progress. I'd tell him about Trinity's college acceptance letters, Destiny's graduation, Marcus's business success, knowing he would have been proud of how his love had multiplied. When I brought Jamie to meet him, laying her tiny hand on his headstone, I told her about her grandfather who chose love and changed everything. She was too young to understand, but someday I'd tell her the full story of how a lonely businessman and a thrown-away girl saved each other. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents' lawsuit had backfired spectacularly, bringing my siblings and I together while landing them in prison. Their greed had created the family they denied us, bonds forged in courtrooms and strengthened by shared healing. We had holiday dinners now where we toasted James and laughed about our terrible biological parents, finding humor in darkness the way survivors do. We compared therapy notes and childhood traumas like battle scars, proof we'd survived something that should have destroyed us. We were living evidence that family could be chosen, created, earned through showing up rather than showing DNA. 10 years after the trial, I received a letter from my biological mother, forwarded through the foundation. She was getting out of prison and wanted to apologize, to explain, to seek forgiveness she hadn't earned. I read it once, noted the return address was a halfway house, then filed it away without responding. She'd made her choices decades ago in an airport, and I'd made mine in a courtroom. Some bridges, once burned, weren't meant to be rebuilt. I had a real family now, including siblings who understood abandonment, a husband who chose me daily, a daughter who would never doubt her worth, and the memory of a father who proved love wasn't limited by biology. The final lesson James taught me was that blood doesn't make family, love does. He proved it every single day from the moment he read stories to a traumatized 5-year-old until his last breath, promising I'd never be alone again. My biological parents gave me DNA and trauma, but James gave me everything else, including the strength to stand in a courtroom and refuse to let them profit from their abandonment. He gave me the wisdom to recognize real family in my abandoned siblings, the courage to trust David with my scarred heart, and the certainty that Jamie would never question whether she was wanted. Most importantly, he gave me the understanding that being chosen is more powerful than being born to someone, that love is a verb requiring daily action, not a noun granted by genetics. As I finish sharing this story, I want to leave you with this thought: if you've been abandoned, you are not what they left behind but what you choose to become. If you've been chosen, you are not second best but first choice. And if you're lucky enough to choose someone else, remember that your love can rewrite their entire story. James Mitchell wasn't my biological father, but he was my dad in every way that mattered, and his love transformed an abandoned airport child into a woman strong enough to stand up to her past and build a better future. What's your own story of chosen family? Have you experienced the power of someone choosing to love you when they didn't have to? Please share in the comments below how non-biological family has impacted your life. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories of triumph over trauma. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that family is about who stays, not who your DNA says should be there. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey, and remember, you are worthy of being chosen, and you have the power to choose love over biology every single day.